Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the So Happy Together podcast. I'm so excited to have everybody here. My name is Ellie, and I'm an LMSW. For those who don't know what that title means, it's a licensed master social worker. I am currently working on my clinical licensure, and I am hoping to use that to help individuals with relationship dynamics and therapeutic interventions. You listening to this podcast tells me that you should up for yourself, for your growth, and for a conversation we're about to dive into. During this episode, I will be talking about my own personal experiences and therapeutic insight, and the kind of information I wish I would have had earlier on when I started dating. Because let's be honest, whenever you start dating, you really don't know much about relationship dynamics. And that's okay, but gaining that knowledge is a feat in and of itself. When I started dating, I was 16 and I did not have nervous system awareness. I didn't have any kind of boundary education. I didn't know about attachment language. And I didn't know how to ask myself what I needed in my relationships. And before I continue with this episode, I do want to invite you to pause and reflect on your own relationship history, if it is there. I want you to think about the patterns you may have engaged in, whether that looks like blaming, withdrawing, carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, or pursuing your partner during conflict. As you listen, I want you to gently refer back to those patterns and offer yourself acknowledgement and grace for what happened. Awareness isn't about self-blame. It's about understanding our relationship patterns, and it's how we begin to interpret the cycles that no longer serve us. For much of my life, I didn't understand myself within my own relationships. I didn't understand why I felt the way I did, or why I felt like love was something that I had to chase after, rather than something I could simply receive from somebody else. I knew I was always trying hard, showing up, adjusting my behaviors, but I didn't have language for what was driving my behaviors. It wasn't until I began looking at my patterns with curiosity instead of judgment that things started to make sense for me. I allowed many things that I shouldn't have in my prior relationships and was over apologetic for behaviors, incidences, or feelings that really didn't belong to me. I grew up in Southern culture, and that played a very large role in my perception of relationships. Relationships felt like they weren't coming from an emotional standpoint and something that was an addition to your life. Relationships felt more like milestones that you were supposed to achieve or check boxes that you had to get ticked off. I was constantly asked questions by friends, family, like, when are you getting married? When are you settling down? When are you going to find somebody? I also heard from other people, they would ask their friends this or say statements like they don't want to settle down. They just don't want to be with somebody. There was this underlying message, especially for women, that having a partner was a requirement for stability. Stability was not something that somebody else could give me or that another person could get from somebody else. Real stability doesn't come from a relationship. It comes from within yourself. What I wish I had heard more about growing up was emotional safety and healthy conflict. No one really explained what those things actually looked like. I didn't know how to talk through problems without things escalating or how to slow a conversation down and stay grounded when emotions were high. I didn't know how to be curious instead of defensive or how to communicate calmly while still honoring my own needs. Those skills weren't given to me or learned, and without them, it was easy to confuse intensity with connection or conflict with incompatibility. I wish I would have known more about nervous system activation or trauma triggers. It also would have been useful to know how to regulate myself because that was not something I was taught. I don't remember there being an emphasis for this whenever I was a child in school or at church. And that just has to do more with the times, I believe, than compared to now. There has been a very big cultural shift on mental health practices. The culture back in the 90s emphasized staying rather than connecting with somebody, which meant that self-abandonment was a common practice and perceived as normal. You had to create harmony with somebody else rather than be honest, and that was to maintain an image and keep the peace. Love was something that you had to maintain, even if it meant that you were going to be hurt. This played a huge role in my attachment system activation, and whenever I did start dating, it reflected my attachment system. I had the tendency to gravitate toward people who made me work for love. I also thought love was supposed to be earned and maintained. I felt safest with people who needed me because I did feel like I needed to take care of others, because that was how I could continue to earn that love. I also mistook intensity for connection because my nervous system was activated and conditioned to equate that activation with attraction to somebody. My attachment style does lean more towards anxious attachment style, and I currently work through that to get earned secure attachment. It's been hard. It's been a long journey. It's one that I continue to go through every single day, and that is with effort, work on my end, and recognition of what I'm doing. This also includes grace for myself for what's happened and empathy. An anxious attachment style will typically form when caregivers are inconsistent. So that means sometimes love is available, sometimes it isn't. Inconsistency can wire a child to be hypervigilant in nature and create a belief that their connection is unstable. So they will have to work hard to continue to receive that love from their caregiver. Growing up, I was raised in the Catholic Church, and the role of Catholicism in my childhood played a major role in my adulthood. I went to private school, and there was a culture there and a strict moral framework that created an atmosphere where my belonging felt conditional. I also had experienced really intense bullying during grade school and into my high school years, and these peer dynamics affected my social life, and they became a part of how I learned to understand my self-worth. Now, don't get me wrong, my parents were definitely there for me as a child, but the environments I was in was something that I was around constantly. I had school authority figures and really heavy religious messaging that communicated that my acceptance had rules and that love could be withdrawn from these individuals at any point in time. I also felt like I had to be quote unquote good, and that was earned through engaging in these practices and following my peers and not questioning authority. The connection with these individuals felt fragile, and I learned how to monitor other people's feelings fairly well because that was in my control. Or at least it felt like it was in my control. I was learning how to anticipate rejection from others, and I also learned that my deviation came with consequences. I didn't want to get in trouble whenever I was a child. I didn't want to be rejected, so this was really hard to navigate through as a kid. And then as a teen. I began processing all of this as an adult, and I did learn that this is how my anxious attachment style was shaped. It wasn't through a lack of love on my parents' end, but it was through inconsistent experiences in the environments I had been in. There were experiences of lack of emotional safety in those environments. The pressure to conform really interacted with my family system. So it was the culture of the school and the power of the authority figures, the church messages that I had received. It created this large unspoken pressure for me that was difficult to hold. I know my parents deeply love me and they're always there for me. I absolutely know this. These different environments made me interpret the world through a lens where I learned at school and at church that love had contingencies. Who I was not okay and needed to be adjusted, and that my connection with others required effort on my end, and it did not require any effort on anybody else's end. These conditions ended up shaping how I learned to attach, and by the time I was an adult, those early messages still went through my mind subconsciously. And they ended up showing up in my romantic relationships. They continued to show up in my social relationships and definitely affected me emotionally. My understanding of these situations is to not place blame on anybody. It is about helping me connect the dots between my childhood experiences and how they've shown up into my adulthood. Because I cannot rewrite what happened to me as a child. I can, however, create some clarity, self-compassion, and choice for me as an adult. And that's what's different from being a child versus an adult, is that I do have more autonomy. I do not have people telling me that I need to be one way or the other. I can be who I am, and I need to practice that self-worth and self-love and continue to value myself for who I am and how far I've come. And the same goes for you. Just to talk more about anxiously attached adults, the common themes for those adults are overfunctioning, there's overexplaining, overextending, apologizing too much, absorbing blame, and then a very noticeable one is fear of abandonment. That's one of the largest defining features of anxious attachment style as a child or even as an adult. It was not my job to keep the peace between me and others as a child. It was my job to recognize my own emotions and navigate those. I did not need to make myself more likable for others because people that value me and love me did not need convincing to stay. There was a constant fear of rejection and the thought of, am I going to go through what I went through as a child? What this looked like for me as a child was taking on beliefs and making myself believe that there were expectations or versions of myself that would be more accepted, even though they didn't truly belong to me. As an adult, in my relationships, this looked like me going along with whatever my partner said, to things that I really wasn't okay with. I did not have that self-advocacy piece because I would have rather been accepted by people, even if that meant abandoning myself. My childhood brought up the belief that relationships couldn't hold conflict. There couldn't be differences of any kind or any misalignment. Anything that could cause conflict needed to be swept under the rug. As a child and as an adult, I pretty much did whatever I could to keep myself safe. And whenever I say safe, I am meaning physically safe. But subconsciously, I was not. Our attachment styles aren't character flaws, though. They are survival strategies that we've learned from an early age, and they do change and adapt throughout our lifetime. My upbringing and environments did create a powerful template for how I thought of myself and how I thought of others, which was if someone is upset, that is my fault. If they're distant, I have to fix it. And if they don't like me, I need to change myself. There was a relationship I was in that completely shifted my understanding of what safety meant. From the outside, it looked calm, it looked steady, it looked mature. Compared to past dynamics that were intense or chaotic, this one felt peaceful. And because of those contrasts, I assumed it was healthy. But calm does not automatically equal emotionally safe. Sometimes calm is avoidance, sometimes quiet is suppression, sometimes predictability is emotional distance. And when your nervous system has been conditioned by chaos, quiet can feel like safety, even if connection isn't actually secure. What I didn't fully understand at the time was how avoidant patterns can look like emotional maturity. Avoidant attachment isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It doesn't chase. It withdraws. It internalizes. It minimizes. It regulates through distance. And when emotional intensity rises, stepping back can feel like control. For someone with anxious tendencies, distance doesn't feel regulating. It feels threatening. That's where the dynamics started to shift in this relationship. There was a social situation that didn't go the way I would have liked. I felt embarrassed afterward and became overly apologetic, which is something anxious attachment often does. When you lean anxious, you tend to assume fault. You overcorrect, you try to repair quickly. But while I was taking responsibility for my part, there was emotional reactions happening on the other side that weren't being communicated clearly. Instead of open dialogue, there was subtle withdrawal on my partner's end. Instead of direct processing, there was deflection. And that's where confusion begins. Instead of direct conversations happening between the people involved, information was passed indirectly. This kind of indirect communication, sometimes called triangulation, often increases insecurity and misinterpretation, and it creates distance, it creates doubt, and it creates a narrative that is probably not true. When conflict isn't addressed directly, trust slowly erodes. And when your partner begins discussing the relationship with others before discussing it with you, it can feel destabilizing. Not because outside input is wrong, but because you are left outside of your own relationship. When my stress increased, I leaned in. When his stress increased, they leaned out. This is an anxious avoidant dynamic at play. One partner will pursue the other to connect and to regulate, while the other partner creates distance to regulate. Neither is malicious, and both are protective. But together, it creates instability. When space was requested, it also wasn't clearly defined. There was no timeline, no plan for reconnection, no clarity about intention with this space. Ambiguous space feels very different from intentional space. Ambiguous space feels like waiting, like scanning, like bracing. And when there's silence without context, the nervous system fills in the gaps, usually with fear. Eventually, the relationship ended, not because there was explosive conflict, not because there was cruelty, but because communication had been internalized instead of expressed. My partner told me during our separation that relationship should be easy, which gave me feedback as to what reality he was living in and how distant his understanding of what a healthy relationship looked like. Concerns with our relationship had been held privately instead of processed collaboratively. And by the time those concerns were spoken out loud, detachment had already begun on my partner's end. The painful part wasn't just the ending. It was realizing that there had been internal disengagement long before I was aware of it. And when ruptures aren't addressed early, they grow. I did inform him that relationships aren't easy. They involve both individuals to be willing to participate. People are way too complex for any relationship to be served on a silver platter. It is a healthy part of a relational process to have ruptures and repair. But repair requires transparency. Repair requires vulnerability. Repair requires two people willing to stay in the discomfort long enough to understand each other. Without that, distance becomes relief for one person and devastation for the other. One of the most hurtful pieces of this breakup was when I did receive a FedEx box with my belongings in it without any communication that my belongings were being sent back to me. There was an unspoken expectation sitting in this box in the form of an empty trash bag for me to send back belongings to my now ex. This unspoken expectation continued to reaffirm what I had experienced through this relationship with lack of communication, and it felt like there was no care for me. The most important realization through this process for me wasn't about the other person, though. I had been shrinking, softening my boundaries, editing parts of myself to feel more acceptable in this relationship. I was trying to be easy to love, and anxious attachment often tells you if I do more, need less, and become smaller, I won't be abandoned. But safety doesn't come from self-erasure. It comes from mutual regulation, clear communication, direct repair, and emotional consistency. This relationship was my catalyst for deeper healing, and it forced me to examine where I overfunctioned, where I tolerated ambiguity, where I confused calmness with security, and where I equated belonging with performance. And it's why I care so much about helping others understand their attachment patterns and nervous system responses. Because once you understand what's happening internally, you stop personalizing everything externally. You stop chasing clarity from people who aren't offering it. You stop shrinking to preserve connection. You start choosing environments where your humanity isn't inconvenient. I kept replaying the story in my head during this relationship that if I can be easy enough to love, then I wouldn't be abandoned by this person. It made me believe that if I did more, then I could earn my stability with my partner. And as painful as this breakup was, it did help me a lot with healing. It gave me more clarity on what my attachment style was, where I was lacking in boundaries, and what I could do to help with conflict resolution in my trauma responses. And this is why I created the So Happy Together podcast. I want to help you understand your patterns and name your attachment style. I want you to be able to identify your nervous system responses and why you're responding the way you are. I want you to be able to recognize trauma that you've experienced and process through it. I also want individuals to be able to set boundaries in their self-worth and have clarity instead of fearing what's happening to them. Understanding pieces of yourself will help you navigate your life more easily. It has also helped me so much and has allowed me to have empathy with myself and have better relationships with people and seek qualities that match mine. As I wrap up today's episode, I want to invite you to pause for a moment. And this is not to analyze, not to judge, but to just notice if you recognize parts of yourself in this episode. And that doesn't mean something is wrong with you if you do. It means your nervous system learned how to stay connected in ways it knew how because of the patterns you carried from your childhood. These patterns came from experiences where love, safety, or consistency felt uncertain. And you don't have to undo everything overnight. Awareness is already a form of change. If love has ever felt like something you had to earn, prove, or maintain through effort alone, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to rest in connection. You are allowed to be chosen without shrinking, and you are allowed to want clarity, consistency, and care. And that doesn't make you too much. I want you to take whatever resonated with you today and sit with it gently. You don't need answers yet. Curiosity is enough for now. And I, again, want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for doing this work quietly, honestly, and at your own pace. We will unpack more in the following weeks. And please, if this episode resonated with you, share with your friends. You can also follow me at the So Happy Together podcast on Instagram and TikTok, as well as Spotify. I will talk to you all soon.